what I wanted to do was sort of like be open source and like help everyone succeed. And the actual incentives of the market I was in, and that would sort of drive the type of company I would make, is very much to build moats, very sort of Web 2 moats, where you're building sort of a company and you're sort of trying to value capture and lock people into your company. And you have an incentive to keep things closed source. And so that was a big reason why I pivoted, was because I felt like by focusing on a protocol for mini apps, I could help more people succeed. I could focus on building open source software. And I felt like that was much more aligned with my brand and how I wanted to make decisions.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have David Furlong, founder at Openframes. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do snapshots with interesting builders, founders, and investors from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with David at Openframes. All right, what's up, everybody? This is the WAGMI Ventures podcast. I'm Tanner, and I'm here today with David Furlong, founder at Openframes. David, what's up? How are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing great. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Denver, and a lot of exciting people around.
Amazing, yeah. I'm sure we'll touch on that at some point, how that's going. But would love to start here, maybe just by way of intro, because if someone even just takes a look at your personal website, I think the width and breadth of what you've worked on and thought about is super fascinating. And so one of the questions I had was just a little bit of how your crypto story evolved alongside your professional story and how they've culminated thus far in sort of building Openframes.
Sure. So I'd say sort of I've been a builder for the web for, over 10 years. And I originally got exposed to crypto in 2014 at a hackathon. I think some friends wanted to hack on something around Bitcoin. And so we gave it a crack, and we were trying to build sort of a Bitcoin-based way to fund open source issues on GitHub. And then I sort of departed from the scene a little bit, and I built a company around volunteering software. And in the meanwhile, I was building some side projects for the web, and I very much felt like the web was becoming less and less open. And there were some sort of corporate networks that were capturing markets in a way that made it harder for people to build new products and experiences for people. And so I was sort of eagerly awaiting some sort of paradigm shift that could sort of displace us from the status quo, which I think is sort of like a local maximum for the internet. And so I was getting very excited by Web3, because I think particularly decentralized social has a tremendous opportunity to sort of take something that's currently sort of locked in corporate networks and democratize it into protocols. And so around 2 years ago, I started tinkering and looking at what was happening in decentralized social. And I found Farcaster, and I got very excited by how they were thinking about both the community aspect and the technology, with a sort of mindset of trying to reach the mass consumer audience. And so I started building on Farcaster, and I built the first third-party client. It was called Discove, and it allowed people to create custom feeds and share them and subscribe to them. And so I was building this, and people seemed to like it. I got into crypto startup school, did that last year. And during the program, I sort of found myself in a tricky spot. I think there were two big problems I was facing. The first was Farcaster was permissioned, and it was quite a small network, and their timeline for growth was longer than sort of an early stage project or startup could sort of handle. And then the second thing I found was that I had a great incentive to try and capture value and sort of not open source my things, and that felt misaligned with my personal goal of making decentralized social succeed. And then the third thing that I found was that I wanted to experiment with plugins and new content types and games and polls and all these things that weren't possible. And in order to actually do that, I could do that in my app, and I did, but it kind of needed to work in other apps too. And so I sort of ran into this issue. How can we actually make mini apps that will work in my app, but also all the other apps in the social protocol? And so in a sort of now somewhat legendary move, basically the day I had to submit my slides for demo day, I pivoted and I rewrote all my slides. I submitted a broken URL for the slides, and then I spent the weekend basically pivoting and recreating my demo pitch. And what I pitched was a protocol for mini apps, starting with Farcaster, that would enable like rich new experiences on social that were uniquely enabled by Web3 social. And so I had sort of reached this conclusion that, the special thing about crypto and the way that Web3 social would create differentiated product experiences relative to Web2 was mini apps. And so pivoted, pitched that, and got to work on building it. And so we started experimenting and really diving into how this would look like, how this would work without compromising UX, performance, security. And so we were building that out. And then we had a bunch of Farcast clients integrate late last year. And we were sort of gearing up for a public launch. And we basically pitched Warpcast. We were like, look, we've built a bunch of these initial mini apps. We were calling them mods. We would love to have you on board. Here's a Farcaster improvement proposal for how to incorporate mini apps into Farcaster. And our pitch was, let's extend Open Graph and put the sort of rich data on URLs that are shared in the network. And then clients can basically interpret that and render a mini app. And then Warpcast decided that they thought it would make sense for this to be part of the Farcaster protocol. And they announced they were doing Farcaster frames. And so that sort of caught us a little bit by surprise. And then since then we've shifted everything and all our efforts to frames related tooling and building. And so that's sort of where we're at now. We're building frames.js, which is the sort of most popular library for building frames. And then the second big thing that we've been working on is Openframes, which is a standard for bringing frames to ecosystems that don't have a Farcaster account or signer. And we really believe that frames are a transformative technology that are going to spread throughout both crypto and Web2. And so we want to enable both developers to easily create frames that work everywhere, and also any ecosystem that wants frames to work in their ecosystem. We want to help them achieve that as well.
Very cool. I mean, crazy journey, right? So super interesting. I think one question I have, as just kind of turning to talk about the work itself, is I'm curious how, with what you're building being so timely, I'm curious, how is what you're building such a stepwise change from how things are kind of usually done or being conceived of currently? Maybe talk us through some of the thinking there.
Yeah. So I think for us, we realized that there is a strong user preference for using one app over many apps. And this was one of our learnings from building a Farcaster client, was that actually the best experience is not switching between a bunch of apps that sort of do niche things, but that the user experience is superior for a couple of reasons if you bundle everything into one app. And that's sort of the super app thesis, I think. It's a bit like WeChat in Asia, and a lot of people have been trying to do this in the West. The second sort of big realization was that like a lot of these super apps start to look like they have apps inside of them, right? And so in order to actually unlock new experiences, you need to move beyond the existing paradigm of, you can like a post, you can like reshare it, you can reply. You actually have a lot of richer interactions that you want to do, right? So you might want to mint something, you might want to RSVP to something, you might want to subscribe to something. And so, especially coming from a sort of developer way of thinking, I think there's a lot of exciting composability if you can allow secure ways for other apps to sort of compose apps. And so Frames, I think, is a massive step in finding a way to compose front ends. And one of the mental models for me that has really resonated is that smart contracts are very exciting because they unlock composable backends. And that means that developers can sort of build apps with composable backends where sort of you reuse someone else's database and backend logic and build an app that sort of leverages that ecosystem. And we haven't for the longest time had that for front ends. And so if you want to integrate a smart contract, you you basically either have to go to the smart contracts website and sort of use their front end, or you have to integrate it yourself. So you have to figure out, how does this smart contract work? How do I interact with it? How do I, make an interface for it and then put that in your app? And so I think frames are moving in the direction of sort of every smart contract will have a front end that's exposed through a frame, and any app can basically give a smart contract an interface in their app without compromising security or UX or anything else. So I think that's the really exciting part. The second big exciting part of this is that because of the way frames work, you can sort of verify that a request is authorized by a user. And so that allows apps to do interesting cross-app actions that are sort of trusted and verified. So for an example, you can subscribe to someone's mirror post or paragraph post within a frame. And the way that works is paragraph gets a message from the sort of client that renders the frame and can verify that a certain Ethereum wallet actually pressed that button and wanted to subscribe. And then in their database, they basically say, oh, add this subscriber that pressed this button. And so that's sort of something that's uniquely enabled by cryptography and sort of crypto rails.
Super interesting. Okay, awesome. Hey everybody, quick thing here. We're excited to announce WAGMI Advisory, your home for all things fundraising, hiring, and partnerships. This is all about supercharging your project with the WAGMI network, consisting of over 20,000 executives, investors, and builders in crypto, all ready to come alongside your project to help it succeed. Get in touch at team@wagmiventures.io to learn more and figure out if WAGMI Advisory is the right fit for your project. Now, let's get back to the show. So one of the core pieces of these conversations are typically asking about kind of challenges and surprises. And I feel like you've actually narrated both sides of that coin fairly well already and how it connects with sort of your journey thus far. And you've already actually touched on a third piece I like to ask about, which is kind of just what's got you excited. It sounds like, expanding the technical horizons are extremely exciting to you, which makes sense given you're a builder. I'm curious if there's any, just given your sort of depth in this ecosystem, I think I'm curious about it if you have any excitement about possibilities from a use case perspective that, things people are building or conversations people are having around ways that this can be, made applicable for end users. I'm just curious if you could maybe ground us in applications a little bit. Like how do you see this being transformative?
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm very excited. I think there's a couple things. So firstly, currently frames can't really do transactions. And so that's something we're going to see in the next couple of weeks. And so one of the really, really transformative things that I'm particularly excited about, and this is kind of a hard problem that may not come in the next 2 weeks, but I see it on the horizon, is that we will have a sort of subset of on-chain transactions that are secure enough to have no risk for the user, in a way that apps can allow users to sort of 1 click or 2 click do a sort of small transaction, whether it's sort of like playing a game or minting something or buying a small amount of a token or, tipping someone. All of these sort of on-chain interactions should have zero risk, and they should be fast and simple. And the current paradigm of crypto is very much sort of not that. So, if you're interacting with a new smart contract, you very much have to sort of trust it, or you have to transaction simulate and sort of understand what's going on. And so the first thing I'm really excited about is for there to be a step change in crypto UX, where you can just have very simple risk-free transactions for consumers. And then the second thing that I think is going to happen with frames is that a lot of wallet apps are going to integrate frames as a means to sort of get their users to have more things to do. And so when combined with these sort of risk-free transactions, all of a sudden, all these sort of on-chain games, all these on-chain primitives that have sort of struggled because of the friction of sort of get user to my website, like convince user that it's safe to interact with this website, and like get users to come back every day. through notification or something else. All those are I think, going to be tractable problems that will have really great solutions. And that's just going to be massive for adoption of these things. And we're already seeing early days of this where, NFTs launched with sort of mint in frame are getting, 10 times as many mints as external links. And then the next thing that I'm really excited by is like, I, we can't be building for just crypto natives, right? Like the goal really needs to be to bring these new technologies and new primitives to the internet as a whole. And I think frames are one of these technologies that a lot of people in tech are going to look at and get excited by. And so I think there may be inroads to, having frames be a delivery mechanism for crypto and sort of wallets into a broader Web2 audience.
Love it. Super interesting. Okay. So I want to take a step back here in a second and ask you a couple more general questions about the space more broadly. But I think I wanted to circle back quickly before that to ask you just about the pivots you made. And I think I'm always really curious, what makes a pivot work versus what makes a pivot definitely not work? Maybe we could just dive in there a little bit before some more general questions about the space, because I think you'd have some really insightful things to say.
Yeah, I have been described as stubborn. And so usually I'm not the first to pivot. I take quite a long-term view of things. I think that is hard when you don't have short-term feedback loops and when you have sort of, shorter time horizons that are sort of forcing functions on things. In terms of my pivot right before demo day, I felt like my timing was off on what I was building. And the second thing that I felt was that my alignment was off, right? So in terms of what motivates me and what sort of drives me and why I'm in this space is very much like trying to help decentralized social succeed and to sort of change the internet. And I felt like my company that I was building had sort of misaligned incentives around that. And so I felt like, what I wanted to do was sort of like be open source and like help everyone succeed. And the actual incentives of the market I was in and that would sort of drive the type of company I would make is very much to build moats, very sort of Web2 moats where you're building sort of a company and you're sort of trying to value capture and lock people into your company and you have an incentive to keep things closed source. And so that was a big reason why I pivoted, was because I felt like by focusing on a protocol for mini apps, I could help more people succeed. I could focus on building open source software. And I felt like that was much more aligned with my brand and how I wanted to make decisions. And then more recently, when Frames launched, we sort of made it wasn't a big pivot, but we sort of accepted that Frames had much more distribution than Mod did, and that it was heading in the same direction as we were with Mod, but the starting place was different, and we sort of had to meet builders where they were building, and that was on Frames. And so we very quickly sort of paused all the Mod stuff, started from sort of Frames and the Frame spec, and went from there. And so, I'm not an expert at pivots. I'm usually quite stubborn, and I'll stick with what I believe. One of the things I think you really gotta stay true to yourself as an entrepreneur or builder is sort of like, why are you building this? If you pivot in a way that compromises why you're building in this space or the sort of the excitement that brought you in, I think that's sort of like a losing strategy. And I think with my previous company, I did that a little bit where we started off with, a bold vision, and then, the market started to tell us things, and we sort of listened, and you have to listen, but we also sort of started to sort of narrow down our market very much in a way that sort of changed the sort of the prospect of it. So I think pivots are very difficult.
Yeah, I think it's actually fascinating. You describe yourself as stubborn. I think it's interesting that some of the motivation for one of your pivots was a stubbornness of kind of the spirit of why you're doing this, right? And, not compromising there. I think there's a lot actually to really admire in that. So that's actually really interesting. So taking a step back then, just wanting to talk about a couple more general questions about the space where I like to ask, like, how do you think about this current moment in crypto, or maybe how would you narrate or interpret the state of things right now, given kind of your focus on decentralized social? I think you have a unique vantage point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I started building on Farcaster in late 2022. And whenever I told people I was building on decentralized social, they would ask me, am I building on Lens? And then I had to explain to them what Farcaster was. And people would give me sort of quizzical look. And for the longest time, Farcaster was small and the early community was great, but it you know, investors weren't interested in it. And there were some builders, but it was very difficult to get funding or to sort of there's no grants. It was a very small network. And in the meantime, sort of Lens was experiencing growth and sort of all sorts of things. And I would say now the roles are very much reversed, where Farcaster through Frames has very much had its moment and it's grown tremendously. And so I would say right now is sort of the moment of Farcaster. And so it's in the spotlight. Everyone's excited by it. Frames are net new and sort of it's now the promised land that everyone's sort of rushing into. And so now Lens is on the back foot a little bit, and some of the other networks, but I think those will rebound and we're going to see more competition. And in general, competition is good. And so I think we're going to see a lot more experiments happen, and hopefully sort of faster iterations as well. Because at the end of the day, in order for this space to succeed, having more people trying things faster is the way to figure out what actually works. And Warpcast has been shipping new stuff so quickly that it's really set a tempo for everyone else. Frames within hours of launching, people had created like tens of frames. Like developers had figured out how frames work from a new document, like programmed things and launched them and gotten like massive adoption. And now we've seen sort of hundreds to thousands of unique frames created and tens of thousands shared. And so it definitely feels like we are accelerating. And with the amount of builders coming into the ecosystem, it's accelerating even more. And so my hope is just that there's not some sort of technological barrier that slows this down. So one such barrier is that Farcaster, the sort of node technology, they're called hubs, has sort of faced some scaling issues as a result of the recent growth. And then the second one is that I hope great builders come in and build something great and are able to sort of build a team and collect resources and really push the space forward. And the third one is for I think one of the most exciting things about Web3 is the idea of protocols sort of replacing corporate networks. And so I'm building a protocol. I think it's sort of more aligned with the question of sort of why Web3, why crypto is like, okay, like protocols can do new things that have different incentives to Web2. And so I would hope that people start to experiment with like, how can we design new mechanisms in decentralized social for, all these problems of sort of curation, of algorithmic feeds, of sort of spam, of sort of rewarding people who contribute in a way that doesn't sort of overly financialize and sort of change the incentives to sort of some sort of short-term speculative thing. And so all these things, I think that's sort of like a ripe market now for innovation, specifically on Farcaster and sort of similar protocols that are going to come around. And so I think now is really like the best time to come into this space. The better time would be a couple months ago and sort of be ready now for this growth. But yeah, I think it's a great time to be thinking about all these sort of social primitives and how we can sort of help grow this to a larger market.
Love it. Okay. So if I could ask you to maybe wax philosophical here for a moment, bit of a recurring question on this podcast is, if I were to put to you, the future of crypto is blank, how would you fill in the blank?
That's a very good question. I think I like crypto as a sort of invisible technology almost, right? So I think all this like bridging chain, specific payment tokens should be abstracted away from users. And so, especially when it comes to social, I kind of feel like the mullet is a great analogy, where sort of web 2 in the front and web 3 in the back. And so I think that's really the way to get adoption, where people don't even need to know it's crypto, and it's just a better user experience, because all of a sudden you have these new primitives like, public private key pairs, and users can actually own certain things, and you can compose across ecosystems and apps without the fear of sort of getting deplatformed either as a user or as an app. And so that's really, I think, the promise of crypto.
Love it. Okay. David, couple last questions here for you. What's your team working on right now? And what's the best way for people to follow along on the journey?
Yeah, thank you. So we're working on two big things. One is frames.js. It's a library for making frames. And the second one is Openframes. And that is a way of making frames that work across ecosystems. So for example, XMTP and a couple of other ecosystems are sort of on board with that and supporting that. And then following along, probably on Farcaster, my handle is DF, so my initials. And yeah, would love to hear from you if you're interested in frames or anything like that. My DMs are open. Very happy to sort of help anyone start their journey in building on Farcaster or frames.
Perfect. David, thank you so much for the time. Super interesting stuff you guys are doing, and couldn't be, more relevant to the moment. So I'm excited to follow along myself, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, take care. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and maybe give us a good 5-star rating and subscribe wherever you're getting your podcasts, so you can get all the latest conversations with the most interesting crypto founders, investors, and builders from across the world. Thanks so much. Have a good one.